All right, welcome everyone. It's really good to have you all here today in this space. I really appreciate you dedicating your time on this Tuesday to spend here. Um, this is the second of MESA's monthly webinars, um, which are hosted every third Tuesday of the month. Um, and today we're really excited to have attendees from all of our MESA programs. Um, and throughout the presentation, we're really going to encourage your questions and reflections. There will be the main presentation by our guest speakers, and then towards the end, we'll have a time dedicated towards questions and discussion. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing all of your voices in that space. Since 2005, Mike Smith has served as pastor of McGee Avenue Baptist Church, where he founded the Center for Food, Faith, and Justice in 2014 as a nonprofit community-based organization in response to the local needs of food sovereignty, health equity, affordable housing, workforce development, and community food security through urban agriculture. Since 2012, Pastor Michael, as he is affectionately called, has also served as adjunct professor of environmental ethics at American Baptist Seminary of the West. During that time, he taught more than 100 classes and workshops on urban gardening, food sovereignty, and sustainable farming practices to more than 300 students, including over 500 veterans, homeless, transitional, or formerly incarcerated adults, and 1,500 high-risk youth. Michael earned his undergraduate degree in international relations and sustainable development from San Francisco State University and began working as a supervisor at the East Bay Conservation Corps upon graduation, where he eventually became the deputy executive director. Michael has a long history of federal grants management, urban gardening, and workforce development for high-risk populations. Pastor Michael holds a Master of Divinity degree and a Master of Arts in Community Leadership from American Baptist Cemetery of the West. Pastor Michael is excited to partner with MESA in the AFP programs, where he can meet and learn with a powerful group of students, farmers, and community activists. So with that, I would love to turn it over to you, Pastor Mike.
Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you, Lauren. Michael and I are really excited to be here. One of the things I will say about MESA, those of you that are steward candidates, Lauren and I were kind of laughing a moment ago about, we know it's a tedious process, but if you make it through that process, MESA is a great organization for you to work with. MESA has done so much with us over the last few years, and we have really been fortunate to partner with MESA because we've met amazing students, not just students, not just participants in our local geographic area. We're in Berkeley, and so we've met great folks from all throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. But we've had international students in our AFFP program, Sri Lanka, Kenya, and those have been fantastic. And we've been the richer for having worked with them. I'm not much on introductions. I fashion myself as a community activist who cares passionately about what happens. I am someone who is integrated and really involved, particularly in environmental justice and food sovereignty movements. But the power is not so much in what people like myself, what we do. The power is in folks like you that really want to make a difference, either as local farmers, you're getting trained, coming and working with places like MESA or Ecology Action, as someone mentioned. You're working on local farms, you're taking that back to where you are, whether it's in cities throughout the United States or international cities or villages or towns. And that's the beauty, I think, of what we do. Today, we're going to talk about urban agroecology. We've been partnered with MESA the last 3 years in the AFFP program, which is a tremendous program. One of the things that we talk about, however, in context is that in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's not a lot of rural farmland. And so how does agroecology really look in the urban setting? So we're going to talk a little bit about that implications. We have, I've done some travels throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And the reality is that there are places and there are urban areas, right, that really don't look the same as if you're on the countryside and developing a rural farm. And so with many of the participants that we work with, they often ask, well, if I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, or if I'm, in greater Los Angeles, or if I'm in, metro Atlanta, or if I'm in, Chicago, Illinois, what does that look like, in the context of the city? And so we've always really talked about how urban agroecology still has the principles of agroecology, still the principles of an agroecology flower and everything that goes with it. But it may look a little different if you're, in the inner city versus on the countryside. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then, one of the things that we really try to do, I think, in all of our MESA programs and partnerships, it's not about subject matter experts telling you. We try to create shared learning spaces. And so your thoughts, your questions, your experience is just as valuable as anyone here. So we want to make sure, as Sabrina manages that there's time for you to ask questions, to give comments as we go. So we're going to just very quickly do something that we do with our students in MESA and some of our other programs to kind of ground us. A very quick guided meditation around agroecology. And then I'm going to have Michael is going to be sharing some slides, and we won't get through the whole thing, but it is recorded. This slide deck is something that we do with MESA, so it'll be available for everyone, and we'll have time for questions. So very quickly, if you just want to center yourself where you are, in a moment of silence, just close your eyes. And right now, I want you to inhale all that you are, the being that you are made to be in all of your multiple identities. And I want you to hold that breath and then breathe out everything that folks told you you weren't or you couldn't be, and folks have tried to define you. Breathe out all of that toxicity that life has tried to pour into you. Now I want you to inhale the power of agroecology. For some of you, that's a new term, but the power of farming. It may be regenerative farming. It may be biointensive farming. It may be farming in a way that industry does not do, that may be counter to what you've been told. But breathe in the power of the ancestral knowledge. Ancestors may not necessarily be someone from the previous century. Could be a parent, could be an elder, could just be a wise person that showed you a different way. And breathe out all of the things that harm our environment, the soil, that pollute the atmosphere, that poison our food supply. and all of the problems all around it. And now I want you one more time to inhale the power that the universe has given you to make a difference where you are. Through your commitment to justice, your commitment to community, your commitment to farming, your commitment to family. And finally, one last exhale, all the barriers that you've put in your own way and the obstacles and the things and the folks that told you it couldn't be done. And know that there is power in you to ground you and center you to all that can be. You can open your eyes now. We start in that space because it's important for us when we begin talking about agroecology, when we begin talking about regenerative farming in general, that we are here in a connected space. But in this connected space, it is important that we affirm one another. It is important that we value one another. And we also acknowledge that there are things and people and systems and things that have come before us. Some systems that have been broken, some systems that have been marred and polluted. But the world with all of its problems still belongs to you and me. And it is up to us to make a difference where we are. So when we start talking about urban agroecology, Michael, if you would get ready to start to share. There's a lot of discussion about agroecology versus urban agroecology. And I was sharing with you earlier, the truth of the matter is there are many similarities, but also there are differences and distinctions. And I think we need to make that clear, why? Is there just one agroecology? And I believe that there is, but I do think that wherever agroecology happens in the world, whether it's in the urban setting, whether it's in the rural setting, there is a particularity that we need to consider wherever we are. It's not a one size fits all model. I think that there are some universalities, but in spite of that, there are those particularities that we're going to talk about and what makes urban a little different and sets it apart. So this is a presentation that we often do with our students in the AFFP. And it's important that we understand we developed this presentation probably, Lauren, somewhere around our second cohort, because we were asked so many questions for many of our emerging farmers. The reality was that they were saying they probably weren't going to get big strips of land or even small strips of land in rural settings. That how could they bring the power of agroecology into the cities or small towns that they were at throughout the Bay Area, or in our case, the wider spectrum of Northern California. Next slide, please. So we really want to talk about, four things quickly, right? Why do we do urban agroecology, or why urban agroecology? And what are the characteristics of the urban setting, right? And then how do you assess urban agroecology, and how, to rethink and reposition urban agroecology. Keep going. So here we are. It's important. How do you put the urban, right, in agroecology? What defines urban, right? So urban, in short, means anything that is not a farm in the country. It's kind of how we kind of contextualize it, right? It could be a city, it could be a suburb, it could be a small town. Some of the academics that we've worked at, like at the UC Berkeley Food Institute, they often use the phrases urban and peri-urban. They do this to get across the idea that urban agriculture occurs not just in inner cities, but in surrounding areas, right? So we're in the heart of the city of Berkeley, and we do a lot of work like in the city of Oakland, and there's a city called Richmond. It's just a couple of miles away, and those would probably be considered more inner city areas. But we work with a lot of our students, not just our MESA participants, but we work with participants in some of our other programs, and they come from like, places like small towns. There's a small town about 15 miles away called Castro Valley. And so how does urban agriculture really look? May not be in the heart of a place like Berkeley or Oakland, but in these small towns and some of these suburban areas, it still looks different than you were on the countryside. Keep going, Mike. So one of the things that we need to do when we start talking about urban agroecology, right? How can it be conceptualized? Because it does look different. Those of you that are from more rural places, and if you've been into cities, you know that some of the issues, Lauren and I were talking earlier about how politics intersects and how public planning and city and regional planning intersects. That impacts how we understand farming, how we understand urban farming, how we understand urban gardening, and how agroecology has to be able to work in places where you may not have 5 or 10 acres, right? You may not even have 1 acre on the countryside. So how do you contextualize it, right? What are those differences, between agricultural systems, and how can the sustainability of urban agroecology be assessed? Because if we cannot assess its efficacy, if we cannot really, assess its impact in our communities, what value is it to you as a farmer? What value is it to a community, particularly a community that really is trying to move towards food justice and ultimately towards food sovereignty, to feed itself and to control some of its own local economy through the food it's growing, right? So what are those methodological differences? There are some things that you can do in the countryside that you may have to scale back in the city. You do have to consider those things, right? A lot of considerations for the different forms of urban agriculture, in their distinct urban, context, right? And so then we begin to look at what are the current challenges, as well as the opportunities. And I think that's one of the things that we, in our MESA classes that we talk about in the AFFP program. There are many challenges, right? Many barriers, and the city creates its own unique set of challenges wherever you may be. But there could also be opportunities. And so how do we get ourselves thinking in line with, not only the problems, not only the obstacles, but where is the niche? Where is the opportunity where we can fill those voids? Keep going. And so part of what urban agriculture talks about is, we kind of meet at the intersection of regenerative farming and the city, right? While typically small urban farms can be efficient and effective, right? In a different way than their rural cousins. They often can take advantage of existing waste streams, right? And that's really important because we know food waste is a huge issue with farming in particular, but there's a huge issue, particularly in cities, particularly where we know that there are higher populations of people in the city, which means there's a higher concentration of waste. How do we divert things from the waste streams? How do we build that back into the farms and the soils in the urban context so people really feel that what would go into the waste stream now is a way within, whether it's a housing project, whether it's a community garden, whether they have a way to bring waste back, whether it's through compost systems, vermicompost systems, other kinds of things like that that begin to feed the soil and go back into really feeding a community, right? What is the potential for local food sovereignty? That is a huge issue. When we talk about local food sovereignty, the reality is that if you are eating food that's grown more than 100-mile radius from where you live, we should begin to think, rethink, and question what does that mean. That's a huge issue in cities where we know that most of our food comes from outside of our states a lot of times. Even in places like California, it is important to understand that has an environmental cost, it has social costs, it has economic costs. And so urban agriculture in particular really looks at that global issue of not just food sovereignty and waste, but what can we do locally to change it, right? And so regenerative farming practices, on a rural farm may have to look a little different than what we do in the context of the city. However, the end goal is still the same. Next, please. And so it's just important. We share this diagram, right? And we talk about 5 principles of regenerative farming, and I'll just go through them real quick. And this is something that is important even in a rural setting. But urban agriculture particularly really looks at the issues of diversity. It looks at the issues of protecting soil surface area. It looks at the issues of living roots. One of the things that you think about, not that these issues do not happen in the rural setting, but in the urban setting, because of things like lead in the soil in higher concentrations, in the city of Oakland, in East Oakland in particular, and even in parts of West Oakland during the 50s and 60s, the 1950s and 60s, there were high concentrations of things like battery factories. There's a lot of things, battery acid, mercury that seeps into the soil. We know that happens oftentimes with toxic dumping and such. And so how do we really build more resilient, regenerative soil surface areas, as well as strong root systems? The other thing you have to consider, one of the other principles is really, how do you deal with things like livestock, right? So, there's a lot of controversy, right, about how do you integrate, cattle, if you're into cattle, right? Cattle can be really destructive as an environmental input, right? There's all the things that range from chemical fertilizers for cow feed. We mow most of the corn that is grown, definitely in this country, but throughout the world, is not necessarily grown for human consumption. It's grown for animal feed. That means there's all kind of inputs that are really not natural to the soil. Michael talks about livestock. We have to really rethink what livestock is. So Michael's very much in to vermicomposting or worm composting. And Michael talks about worms as livestock, but a healthy livestock, right? That helps to regenerate our soil. And so we really think about, kind of the cyclical nature. In the city, we have to be even more conscious sometimes than we are in urban settings. And so it's important to really hold those principles dear to what we do if we're going to make change in urban settings. Next slide. And so then finally, we start talking about, what is our ecological footprint, right? How does our ecological footprint, carbon inputs, right? Settlements and developments. In Berkeley, one of the big things that we're dealing with in Berkeley and Oakland and throughout the East Bay of San Francisco, and I would say the entire Bay Area and much of the United States, right? Housing is one of the biggest issues we do. And as we continue to talk about what happens in urban areas, high concentrations of the unhoused, but we also see great like skyscraper developments going up. What does that mean for open space? What does that mean for food sovereignty and food security, in urban areas? How can we bring, urban agriculture as a means of relieving some of our food needs, our dietary needs? The reality is there's a lot of work that Michael and I do as well in the areas of housing and homelessness. And because we work across both spaces, you would think that some of our colleagues in urban agriculture would really also, understand the challenges around housing and vice versa. Some of them are very diametrically opposed to one another. There are some folks that say we don't need another urban farm. We don't need another urban garden. They will say that urban farms and urban gardens have just become tools of gentrification in communities. And other folks say the last thing that we need is another housing development because the people that need it the most can't afford to live there. Lost in the debate is what is our carbon footprint? What is our ecological footprint when it comes to settlement? And that doesn't even begin to talk about the issues of forestry, right? You know, there's issues of forestry, the more paper products, as much as we talk about going to paperless and electronic, well, we also know that even in the carbon footprint, e-waste is a problem. But then there is the issue of forestry. What does that mean? Not just in terms of how we clear cut forests, but in terms of wildfires. That's a huge issue in California. And then we talk about things like fisheries and overfishing. How does that impact, right? Not only urban farming, but the totality of the population that we're setting. Next slide. So it also, when we talk about urban agriculture, and this is one of the things that's huge, urban agriculture, agroecology says it must include a context and a commentary on racial justice, right? And so it needs to be able to lift up how historically marginalized communities have been disregarded in the agroecology or in the farming movement in general. I talked to you a minute about eco-gentrification or the illusion of inclusion. A lot of folks that are, fixed on urban agroecology will say that when we start talking about urban agriculture, urban agroecology, the people that are leading the movement often don't look, at least on the surface, particularly people of color, particularly indigenous communities. And if agroecology is really just used to gentrify a community, does it really have any real ethical value, right? Does urban agroecology, just become a tool for gentrification, right? It must reflect both the struggles as well as the expertise of those urban farmers. There are many people that have had ancestral knowledge or cultural knowledge when it comes to agriculture, agroecology, and agroecological methods that oftentimes are not lifted up because maybe they didn't attend the university. Maybe they are not at the forefront of places like the USDA or others, in terms of being subject matter experts, but they do have knowledge and they need to be evaluated, right? And this is particularly true, in terms of urban and Black and indigenous communities in particular. Many cities often can ignore the impacts of structural racism while implementing food and agriculture policy. And that's really one of the things that helps sets urban agroecology apart because it does have that deliberate critique. One of the things that we talk about in all of agroecology is the power of participatory action, where we bring community and universities and subject matter experts and cities together to really think about how can we solve problems. No one entity has all of the knowledge, all of the expertise. How do we value that? And it's important because we need to create more inclusive spaces when we think about, what we want our food supply, what we want our food systems to be. If we're moving towards one of the major principles of agroecology as a whole, which is food sovereignty. And I think we need to really consider how that really looks, the many shades, the many identities, gender, genderless, whatever that may mean in context of food sovereignty. That critique must be a part of the movement of food. Next slide, and then I'm gonna get ready to stop. I just want to show you a couple of things. These are a couple of the urban gardens that we've worked through. In this corner in the right, we had a program several years ago where there was a backyard garden program where we were going to the homes of seniors and we were using some of our young people, using some of our people that were trained as well as community volunteers to go into backyards and build gardens. We have funding to do that through the city of Berkeley and the San Francisco Foundation. And we were going in and we were, building up, particularly seniors and low income folks. On the left is a home in West Oakland that really converted, really an empty lot. And they did this over many years because that soil was really bad. And they had to really build the soil up because the challenges I spoke about in the urban context, they had to really go in and remove some of the toxicity of the soil. And they did not do it over a season. This took about 5 years, but now it's a thriving garden. And those are the kinds of things that we need to think about. Go to the next slide and then I'll stop. So part of that is what separates urban agroecology is that we don't just talk about productivity. A lot of times, if you are a farmer in a rural setting, particularly if you're farming as a business, you cannot avoid the issue of productivity because the truth of the matter is, if you are in the business of farming, you have to think about, getting your stuff to market. But urban agroecology has more. Some urban gardens are there to really be productive, to be market gardens, and that's great. But there are different types of gardens. There's youth training gardens. There are workforce development gardens. Our garden at the Center for Food, Faith, and Justice really serves, multiple purposes. It's a small plot. It is there to really teach young people the power of urban gardening. We have a program or had a program pre-pandemic called Beyond the Table. It was a workforce development program that really took people who were homeless, transitional, previously incarcerated, and we were teaching them urban agriculture as a job skill and a micro enterprise skill. And so urban agriculture, urban agroecology looks different. It's not just the lens of how much you can grow, how fast you can grow it. There are things. Gardens are also centering spaces in the urban setting. And so there's a wide range of why folks do urban agroecology. And that's one of the major things that sets it apart. I'm going to pause there, Sabrina, because I don't want to hijack time, but this presentation is available. And we'd love to hear people's thoughts or any questions as you take them.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Wow. I really appreciate that ending sentiment on beyond the lens of productivity. And I think kind of unlearning this idea of farms and garden spaces really solely as means of productivity. And they are certainly that, but also, as you pointed out, so much more. And I've certainly seen that here just in my short time in the Bay Area. And I would love, so we're now moving into more of our discussion-based question and answer time. So if anyone has questions that they would, that they have come up for them, please share those in the chat or unmute and feel free to ask Pastor Mike directly. Let's see, Diane is joining us from Eco Village. That's exciting.
Yeah, this is Hillary. May I please ask a question?
Of course, Hillary.
Yeah, so this is Hillary. I'm a farmer. I'm actually in Fulton County in Atlanta. I have a little over 10 acres. And I want to ask the question, you talked about the illusion of inclusion, Pastor, and I want to ask you to briefly speak to what I have found when it comes to some of the terms that are associated with agroecology, like sustainability, the use of permaculture, the use of organic. I think that the origins of those methodologies have come from indigenous people and have come from our ancestors. And now I find that there is a obvious monetization and appropriation and a monetization of those terms. And I feel sometimes that organizations are led by people who then want to turn around and sell me those methodologies that actually came from the original people. Do you have any comment regarding that?
Yeah, so Hillary, first of all, kudos to your 10 acres and what you're doing in Atlanta. I mean, and I think the faces and the voices of people like you and Sabrina was commenting on Dr. Shyam Shabaka, who was my mentor in joining this webinar. I think that you have to keep that sentiment in front of folks, whether you're meeting with local officials, other people in the non-for-profit farming world or industrial farmers. You have to keep that sentiment at the forefront. You know, one of the presentations that we do, one of our most controversial presentations that we do, even in the AFAP classes, when we start talking about biochar, and you know, biochar or preta, whatever you want to call it, we know that indigenous communities have been burning, you know, burning wood for millennia, right, and putting it back into the soil. But biochar in the last 15 years has been a huge issue, right? A huge marketing issue. And depending on the students that come in, Hillary, there are students that like, well, I just first heard about this, or other students like, well, wait a minute. You know, I know indigenous communities been doing this, or I know my great grandparents or grandparents was doing this, you know, back in rural Mississippi and blah, 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 blah. And so I think one of the things that we often know is that a lot of the people who have really been long-term farmers through millennia, right, have never gotten the credit for it. And there are things that you know, and it is important that you really make sure that you are unrelenting with people that try to package it and sell it to you, as something that is new. And I think it's important to hear that from voices like yours or voices like a Shyam Shabaka. I will say this, and we'll move on unless you have something else. Let me tell you this. In the early 90s, when Shyam Shabaka started really getting me and training me in environmental justice and urban agriculture, Shyam and I would often go, to conferences, workshops, and everybody would be talking about urban gardening, particularly with Black and brown kids, and in urban areas and new methodologies. And there would be very few faces that would be Black and brown faces, but we knew that they were there. And Shyam was tenacious about making sure that we were seen in those spaces. And it's unfortunate that it happens like that, but I think that it is important that you are a living testimony, not just to what is happening right now, but to the knowledge that you've obviously extracted from your family and from the community over time. And so we have to stand strong, and say that, yeah, when you want to talk about inclusion, inclusion and diversity has to look, like some of the people that may not necessarily fit the mainstream profile. So I appreciate your question.
Thank you.
Yes, any further questions? Same thing, feel free to unmute as Hillary did. Raise them in the chat. I see here, yeah, Katya is commenting that she'd definitely like to have the presentation shared, and that, speaking to some of the terminology gentrification, and I don't know, maybe Pastor Mike, you could speak a little bit more for those that gentrification is a newer term, what that has looked like, maybe here historically, what it currently looks like, and what have been the implications in terms of urban farming.
So this is, yeah, this, Sabrina, this is a really challenging situation when you start talking about gentrification in urban farming.
Yeah.
The reality is, in communities like we're in at CFFJ, we're in South Berkeley, and South Berkeley probably 50 years ago, 40 and 50 years ago, it was still historically primarily an African American community. West Oakland, which is kind of adjacent to where South Berkeley is, even more. And I don't want to bore people, but there were a lot of things that happened in the 1970s, politically, economically, and the neighborhoods began to change in the early to mid 80s. There was a real influx of crack cocaine, the influx of available assault-style weapons, which we're still talking about and dealing with in America today, right? That really the influx of those weapons started happening in the mid 1980s, early to mid 1980s, and here we are in 2023, and we're still talking about assault weapons bans. But the reality is there was also a loss in many of those communities of blue collar manufacturing jobs. And so historically, particularly many of the African American and Latinx people that inhabited those areas, they couldn't afford to live there anymore, right? And so, by the middle or end of the 80s, neighborhoods started changing significantly. And as the homeless population increased, as more Black and brown people, could not stay in their homes. And again, I keep referencing Shyam Shabaka because he was at the forefront in Berkeley of trying to help people save their homes in the work he had done with the city of Berkeley's public health department. The reality is that as more affluent people, and not just white folks, just more affluent people began to move in, the neighborhoods began to change, not just in terms of housing, not just in terms of ethnicity, not just in terms of businesses, but in terms of the availability of open space, right? And so all of a sudden, gardens became like a great way. When Shyam Shabaka was doing gardens, it was about really teaching and training young people and teaching and training people that needed second and third chances. But then gardens became more gathering spaces, but they weren't welcoming necessarily as much to people who had traditionally been there. And so they began to be symbolic of gentrification, of folks pushing, others out. And one of the things that we're very conscious of in our garden at CFFJ, we say it is a human rights garden. It is a welcoming garden. No matter who you are, people can belong. So when Michael's, in our garden, we got folks that just walk by and it's like, can I come in? Can I? And we want people to participate, but we also want to know, the young people that we serve in our community, that they are welcome, that their families are welcome, that everybody is welcome. And that's a hard thing to convey. It sounds good on paper. But there's some folks that will say, oh, they can be welcome, they can be affirmed, and other folks, well, we don't really want that element. We don't really want that element present. And so we got to break some of those barriers if we're not going to be, gentrifiers. And we want to talk about inclusion. We want to talk about affirmation. We want to talk about diversity, but it has to reflect in our actions and the work that we do.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. It was clear.
Yes. Yeah. With that, I want to give, if Shyam has anything to add to that, or you'd just like to say hello to the space, and introduce yourself, definitely feel welcome to do that, Shyam. Okay, well, that offer stands. Um,
I have a question for
sure, yeah.
Pastor Smith.
Hey, Laura.
Do you think of regenerative agriculture and agroecology as the same, or like what are the differences between those two terms?
I think the big their practices that are the same. Okay, where agroecology differs from just traditional regenerative agriculture is that agroecology is a movement. Now, I will tell you, in recent months, I've had people that have said to me, well, regenerative agriculture is a movement too. So I'm not even trying to go there, but Lauren, I would say that to me, agroecology is more deliberative because in those foundational things beyond the regenerative aspects of and the biointensive aspects of agroecology, participatory action is ingrained. Land justice or land defense is ingrained in what agroecology is, right? The regenerative folks would tell you, well, we do some of that too, and that we're also about food systems change and food sovereignty, which, again, are foundational to agroecology. I think agroecology is more deliberate. Don't tell some of my regenerative farming friends that, because they might beg to disagree. But I would say that is where the difference is, that there is a political movement in agroecology, and particularly those issues of land justice and land defense, food sovereignty, and participatory action, are up front with what agroecology is. And that's one of the reasons why I kind of fell in love with it.
Yeah, I don't know if you'd agree, but my sense has been that the same kind of people who have now made regenerative agriculture the big buzzword were some of the same people, and predominantly white people who turned permaculture into a money-making kind of certificate, get your certificate, permaculture design certificate kind of thing. And and that regenerative agriculture does seem to be more focused on the techniques, agricultural techniques that are hopefully healthy for the environment in our soil, but agroecology is much more of a movement that encompasses social, political, injustices, and as well as farming practices. Is that?
No, I do agree, and again, and you're right, and I think Hillary was right too when she was talking earlier about the permaculture piece, right? That it's not that permaculture is bad, but permaculture was started to be marketed as more of an exclusive space, and then how do folks that may find themselves on the outside, and again, this is not just black and brown folks, this could also just be wherever you are, that historically you may not fit the mold of the permaculture piece, right? And so I think it's really important that we recognize that. And I do think that agroecology, does try to break down some of those barriers, at least in theory, right? And our task and our job, whether we're in the urban or a rural setting, is to say, how do we make this, a living, right? A living movement, so that people feel that wherever they are, they have a right not only to exist, but to participate. And this is the way that we should be doing things, in a way that uplifts, all, as opposed to excluding some.
Thank you. This is Hillary. May I please ask another quick question? So I also have forestry on my land, and I'm a member of the Georgia Forestry Association. And I also have fish, so I have aquaculture going on here. We produce fruits and vegetables. Can I ask, what do you think will be the effect? I see a lot of buzz, and Atlanta is one of 17 cities that have been designated for the whole urban forestry, urban agriculture, and carbon initiatives. Now that the USDA is literally about to flood money into urban areas for these particular areas, again, for forestry, for carbon, and for growing in terms of urban agriculture. What effect do you think that this will have on this movement? I find that often whenever I show up, whether it's at forestry, whether it's at egg handling, whatever it is, I'm usually one of maybe 2, maybe 3 people there with hundreds of people in the room.
So, Hillary, I'm gonna say this. I'm gonna say this to you. When I was talking about my time under Cheyenne, and even in my time now, we've been at many of these tables too. Unfortunately, what happens a lot of times is, and you know, the state, whether it's the state of Georgia, state of California, you know, or you know, obviously the USDA or whatever, you know, it a lot of times, and this happens even with private foundations, you know, there are organizations, and Lauren, I'm trying to be as gentle as I can with this, right? There are organizations that are often already designated or almost earmarked for where some of that funding goes. Now they can never tell you that. And sometimes, it may be who who's on a particular board or who has a connection with a local legislator, or congressional representative. And I know one of the complaints that often comes, from smaller and especially grassroots organizations is that they can never get to the table. And then oftentimes what they're told, from that major money that comes flooding in, well, you don't have the capacity. You don't have the capacity for us to fund you at this level. And these organizations do. Well, if they're not willing to invest and train and provide, the training and technical assistance for organizations, right, that need support, right, how can you ever, as a small farmer, expect, to grow into that, into that mode? So, I don't want to discourage anyone, and Shyam, you could probably speak to this even better than me, but I've seen this in many instances, again, both in the state, the federal government, and even in the private foundation world. And it's just something you got to be real about, that does happen, even when they say this money is available. Sam, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but your experience, could probably shed a lot of light on what Hillary's saying. You on mute, bro. Cheyenne, you got to unmute yourself. Sabrina, can you unmute Cheyenne?
Yes, I'm about to try. Let's see.
Can you hear me now?
Oh yeah,
Yes.
perfect.
No, I was saying, I think you're doing an excellent job, Mike. And you speak truth to power. I mean, that's the reality of it. For certainly, I happen to sit on the board of certain organizations, and I can definitely see the discrepancy that exists between what they consider to be organizations that are viable and non-viable. So, but I think we have to continue to struggle and speak truth to power in that particular sense, because it's what you're saying is so true, and it's not limited to just what we feel that we're talking about now, but it's throughout the board. It's not just limited to urban agriculture or rural agriculture or even agriculture in itself. It's throughout the whole system. It's a systemic situation, and it's a lot of it couched in truly racism and classism. All right. I won't call the name of a certain organization, but I sit on the board of it. I can see the way in the difference in the ways in which the state of California treats certain organizations very versus based on who's sitting on a board and who's directing the organization versus actually rather than judging them by the work in which they do. So it's, and anybody that's not cognizant of that is not really dealing with the seeing things as they really are. And I think that's really important. But I would like to mention too, Mike, I'd like to mention for the people who are part of your webinar here that we're going to make some a series of books available through Food First, which I'm the president of, and it's available to your organization, which you can distribute to the people in a lot of it covers some of the topics that you're talking about today. So that's something that I've been in communication with you on, and that's going to come to fruition sooner than later. So keep tuned for that. Okay.
Excellent. Excellent.
Thank you, Shyam.
You bet.
We're looking at our time here. We have about 5 minutes left. So I want to invite final questions, reflections, anything that's come up for you in response to what's been shared today. Feel free to, again, put that in the chat or share it with the group. Hold that space for just a little bit longer. Okay. Yeah, I have my own list of questions here, Pastor Mike. And I'm trying to think of which one is best to close this out. Which I guess I'm curious about how I think land access is something that is a barrier to food sovereignty, kind of across the board, whether it's in urban or rural or peri-urban settings. And so I wonder what that has looked like here in Berkeley and the East Bay specifically in terms of the work that CFFJ has done and in terms of acquiring land or partnering with organizations that have access to land in community farm contexts. Like, I don't know, what has that looked like?
It has not looked easy. I will tell you this. We benefit even in our small space because the church owns property, right? But part of it is mindset, right? There's the reality, again, if any of you all, have been to the Eco Village, it's a beautiful space, and Shyam for 20 years has done, an amazing, job. Most settings in the urban context, right? They're smaller spaces. So what we have tried to do on our small spaces, encourage other faith institutions, other nonprofits, look, can you create an edible garden? Can you create an edible schoolyard? How do you, look at things? Now, there are things like the city of Berkeley in particular, it has, as many cities do now, urban agriculture initiatives. But again, there's the issue of inclusion and how do the farmers, and the gardeners closest to the ground, how do we get behind organizations like that? So it's not just the same, old folks, the same players that are getting, the resources, even if you have, you know, the open space. Shan probably got tired of me I was a young college student. And Shan was doing all kinds of stuff, and he was doing stuff, and I would always ask him, but how are we gonna do this? How are we gonna do this? How are we gonna do this? And he said something to me maybe 30 years ago that I've always taken with me, because this is the other side. When you get outside of policy, I kept asking Shan all these questions, and one day he said, Mike, we're gonna have to learn how to be as we are becoming. I've never forgotten that, Cheyenne. I've never forgotten that. And the reality is that in our speaking truth to power, we are going to have to reimagine ourselves sometimes. And we're going to have to challenge policymakers. And we may have to challenge some folks around us to also see that they can be as they are becoming. When we started, you know, Food, Faith, and Justice, I'm just going to tell you the truth. There were people like in the congregation that laughed. They laughed. And there were other people in the congregation that were angry. They were angry, you know. And so the reality is, but I never forgot what Shyam said to me. And Shyam said this to me back like in 91 or 92. I never forgot what he said. You know, I didn't understand it. It didn't really manifest until maybe about 20 years later. But when he first told me, I just, you know, okay. And now I understand. And that's what we're going to have to do. And it's not just me. I mean, Michael understands that. The team that we work with. And I think that was kind of the beauty, even in the AFFP, that we were meeting a lot of people that understood. Maybe we don't have an acre. We definitely don't have 5 or 10 acres. But what can we do with what we have? And how can we challenge those that need to be accountable? You know, city council people, you know, state senators, legislators, or whatever. How can we challenge them, you know, to start thinking the same?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I love that quote, and I have it down for myself now. I think it speaks so much to the visionary work that is so essential when we're embedded in these larger systems and movements towards justice and undoing systems. And yeah, thank you for bringing that forth into this conversation.
Sabrina, can I make one more comment? This is Hillary, and
Yeah,
maybe we can
sure.
connect in the background, but we have started, myself and someone else has started a movement here in Georgia, and we're just getting it off the ground, called 1/10 Acre. So we have discovered, I do have my USDA farm number, and I am also a sanctuary because I have protected animals. Discovered that according to the USDA, you only need 1/10 of an acre to receive a farm number. And that is not widely known. And so there are many people who are in developments who have 1/10 of an acre.
Right.
That's, you know, that's what, 4,300 or whatever square feet. So, you know, perhaps we can connect and begin to extend that extension of that knowledge, that you only need 1/10 of an acre to be a farmer. And many people think they are looking for 5 acres or 3 acres.
That's right.
It took me over a year to really get to that point. It is a matter of educating, and that was literally pulling teeth. So, you know, perhaps we can see how we can connect to extend that message. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank you
Hillary.
so
Love
much,
to
Hillary.
do that. Love to connect with you.
Wonderful. Yeah. After this meeting, if it's all right with you, Pastor Mike, I will share your contact information out along with the presentation and with everyone who is in attendance today. So they'll be able to get in touch with you about anything that came up during our time today. And yeah, with that, I'd just like to kind of give you a little bit more time if you'd like it, just for closing words or remarks or a final sentiment or not.
Again, my only closing thoughts is, you know, hey, I want to appreciate the people that have been in this space, you know, and again, you know, those that are prospective, stewards for MESA. I really encourage you and hope it really works out for you. I think it's a wonderful opportunity. I want to thank MESA for allowing Michael and I to be in this space. And again, I think the people that are most important, right, are folks like you, Hillary, that are there. I know Shyam doesn't like me saying this a lot, but he's probably, outside of my parents, when it comes to the space of urban agriculture, he's probably more responsible for me than anybody else. And he has got a wealth of knowledge, and he's just somebody, that I definitely think, if you get to know Shyam and pick his brain, just a wealth of knowledge, and he says it's not just about farming, not just about public health, but just the wisdom that he has. And so I just appreciate him being in this space with us, with you and Lauren today. So
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you all so much. Again, this is recorded, so it will be posted to MESA's YouTube after today's session ends. We will be hosting another webinar next month, details on that to come. But with that, I want to wish everyone a really great rest of your days, afternoons, evenings, wherever you are. And we hope to see you next time. And thank you all so much again. For
thank
being
you,
with us.
Sabrina. Thanks, Lauren.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.